Thanks to all of you. It's great to see so many people here interested in hearing more, exploring more about the photographs of Janet Mendelsohn, which, as Helen mentioned, if you want to actually see them in their true glory, I think it's much better to actually see them beautifully framed and hung on the wall of the Ikon gallery in the exhibition which I co-curated with Jonathan Watkins, who's here in the audience, and my colleague Professor Matthew Hilton, rather than on this rather dodgy PowerPoint. And the show is on until the 3rd of April, so there's plenty of time to go and check the photographs out in that way. What I want to do today is just give you, tell you a little bit more about Janet Mendelsohn, who she was, and in particular the historical period in which she was operating in. Mendelsohn was in her early 20s when she arrived in Birmingham from the United States, where she was born and brought up. And as Helen mentioned, she came to Birmingham to study at the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which I'll talk more about a bit later on in the lecture, but which was coincidentally, for much of its existence, based in this very building at the very top of the Muirhead Tower. Mendelsohn spent 2 years in Birmingham between 1967 and 1969, and this was a really profound period of social change across the city of Birmingham for a number of reasons. First of all, the growing immigrant presence, immigration from first the Caribbean, then South Asia, and increasingly East Africa, significantly increased by the late 1960s, and Birmingham was one of the places in which these immigrants would make their home. But also Birmingham became known as or seen anyway, generally, as being a kind of the hotbed of increasing hostility towards this immigrant presence for a variety of factors. One, some of you will know, in nearby Smethwick in 1964, the Conservative candidate Peter Griffiths won an election on an overtly anti-immigrant election ticket, including with the unofficial slogan, "If you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour." 4 years later, Enoch Powell, the very prominent Conservative politician, made what would later become known as his Rivers of Blood speech, in which he talked about how he predicted that the, quote, black man would have the whip hand over the white man, and he advocated a policy of voluntary repatriation of all immigrants living in Britain at that time, and he made that speech at a central Birmingham hotel. So Birmingham during this period became known for increasing hostility towards immigration. Other important social change in this period too. Birmingham's built environment was also going through a period of profound change in this moment, including with the constructions of big civic architectural set pieces. So, for example, what has now become the old new Bullring was opened in 1964. The concrete modernist building opened, so 3 years before Mendelsohn arrived into Birmingham. There were plans afoot to build again what's become the old new Library of Birmingham, which has now currently been knocked down. And there was also the construction of the inner city ring road, which many of you will still use today, and which ripped through inner city areas of Birmingham at will. There's also in this period an accelerated programme of slum clearance. So the slums that were still in place in the post-war period, finally, by the late 1960s, were beginning to be demolished in the context of a commitment by the Labour government of that period. And in the time that Mendelsohn spent in Birmingham, 14,000 houses were demolished in those 2 years. And by some estimates, Birmingham was actually renewing itself faster than any other city in Europe. So I think the work that Mendelsohn produced during this period was both a representation of such changes and an exploration into how they were experienced by often by those who were most affected by them. So by immigrant communities, by those who were living in areas that were being cleared by the processes of slum clearance, etc. As I'm sure most of you will know, Mendelsohn focused her attention on Balsall Heath, which is, of course, the district of Birmingham, less than 2 miles from where we are all today, and which was not only a home of a significant immigrant population, was not only the backdrop to a process of slum clearance, but, of course, was also one of the biggest, well, the biggest red light district in Birmingham, and one of the biggest red light districts in the country. According to some estimates, as many as 200 sex workers were said to have operated in Balsall Heath in the late 1960s, and this was the other really prominent critical side of Mendelsohn's work. Now, just before I move on, just a quick note about definitions and terminology. I'm talking about Balsall Heath. I know that boundaries and strict boundaries are often fluid and open to change. Many of the photographs you'll see today may not strictly have been technically in Balsall Heath. They may have been in Highgate or other associated areas. The definition that I'm using, though, is what the general public, or the media at least, would refer to as Balsall Heath. And I think we can all see a kind of example of the fluidities of boundaries when we're thinking about the most recent electoral boundaries, which, according to some people, will mean that just up the road from Balsall Heath in Moseley Village will technically not actually be in Moseley according to the latest electoral boundaries. So boundaries are fluid. I'm referring to Balsall Heath here in terms of how the general public would have probably referred to Balsall Heath, and certainly how the media was. So using her two cameras, a Leica M3 and a Nikon F, Mendelsohn would take some 3,000 photographs in Balsall Heath. In this respect, she was part of a wide range of spectators who were engaged in the surveillance of Britain's inner city streets, including other much more high-profile photographers of working-class life, people like Bill Brandt, Shirley Baker, and Roger Main, people who photographed working-class life in Manchester, in Salford, and often in London too. But what made Mendelsohn distinctive was her focus on prostitution and the fact that she conducted scores of interviews with her subjects, including with this person, Kathleen, who Mendelsohn identified as a sex worker and who became the focus of a photo essay based on her everyday experiences in Balsall Heath. Kathleen is not this person's real name, and throughout this lecture, any name that I do use is a pseudonym. The distinctiveness of Mendelssohn's photographic eye is also to do with her attachment to the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. So the centre was established in 1964 by Richard Hoggart, newly appointed Professor of English at this university, off the back of the success of his earlier book, The Uses of Literacy, which was a book about the effects that new forms of mass media were having on traditional forms of working class life. So Hoggart envisaged that his new centre would be a place in which that kind of research could be expanded on, and in which popular culture and working class life could be subjected to serious, rigorous, scholarly research. Now, it's worth pointing out that the centre was, from the beginning, extremely experimental. Cultural studies prior to 1964 did not exist in any meaningful form. Certainly didn't exist in any institutional form. There was no discipline or field called cultural studies prior to 1964, which meant that the centre had to be very open to forms of experimentation, including an American student like Janet Mendelsohn, who wanted to use photography as a tool for her academic research, which indeed this was the result of that ambition. Now, I think that's the experimentation of cultural studies is illustrated by the fact that in 1967, when Janet arrived in Birmingham, the centre was formally attached to an English department, with a very kind of conservative, traditional areas of expertise in areas such as the plays of Shakespeare. So you can only imagine how, Janet Mendelsohn's more senior colleagues who were experts in the plays of Shakespeare would have viewed Janet's project to use photography as a tool of academic research and to photograph contemporary culture and the experiences of immigrants and sex workers. I can imagine there probably would have been a few raised eyebrows. In October 1969, this photograph, which I showed at the beginning, appeared on the front cover of the Centre's annual report. In the same year, Mendelsohn's photo essay on Kathleen was published in Alta, which was the University of Birmingham's now defunct cultural review. In 1970, Mendelsohn returned to the United States, where she took up a job at Harvard University and showed the work again at the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard. But aside from a set of brief retrospective notes that act as an accompaniment to the archive, which was available at the Cadbury Research Library, Mendelsohn has never actually provided a detailed commentary to her work. She's never actually written anything that says, this is what I did and this is how I did it. By the time her archive was brought back to Birmingham in 2014 and made publicly accessible as part of the wider cultural studies collection here at the Cadbury Research Library, Mendelsohn's photographs had not been seen in public for almost 45 years. So it goes without saying, I guess, that in that respect, Mendelsohn's archive is highly unusual. I think it falls somewhere between that of an academic, that of a photographer, and that of an artist. And for that reason, there's a huge amount of unknowns about her work. We're not able to ask Janet Mendelsohn exactly what she was doing in Birmingham, partly because it was 45 years ago, and that's a long time by anyone's standards. But for the main reason is, Janet's recently suffered from a serious illness, which had a detrimental impact on her memory. So there were kind of lots of unanswered questions about the work she was doing and about the particular nature of her photographic eye, and we're only able really to kind of speculate as to the precise influences she had when she was conducting this period of work between 67 and 69. And to my mind at least, there are basically, broadly speaking, 4 main influences. So the first influence, I think, is that the centre that she was a part of in the late 60s was becoming increasingly politicised. Hoggart's influence was on the wane, and the influence of his deputy at the centre, Stuart Hall, was becoming increasingly significant. The centre occupied an important role in a big student sitting that took place here at the university campus, which locked the Vice-Chancellor out of his offices for a week. And the centre was also becoming increasingly interested in how women were being portrayed in the media, in particular at this point in girls' magazines. So you can imagine when Mendelsohn was out photographing sex workers, trying to come up with a more authentic representation of female sex workers, you might imagine that this growing interest at the centre in the way in which women are portrayed in the media may have had an influence on her work. Mendelsohn had also been an undergraduate at Radcliffe College, and that I think is the second major possible influence on her work. Radcliffe College was the women's college of Harvard, and was known, even in the late 1960s, for its extensive photographic collections and extensive records of photographs relating to women in the United States history. And we don't know for sure, but we can guess, we can imagine that Janet, as an undergraduate at Harvard, at Radcliffe, may have had access to those collections, and that may have had an influence in her work in the late 1960s. We know for a bit more certain that Mendelsohn was interested in, certainly in United States race relations, and the reason that we know that is because of this photograph here. You can tell we've been trawling through the 3,000 negatives with a fine-tooth comb, and we've actually found this photograph, which is a photograph of Janet's bookshelf in Birmingham in the late 60s. A number of things you might find interesting. There's some aspirin on the shelf there, you can see, you can make that out. Some bananas. More interesting, though, I think, probably, is the fact that on her bookshelf are books like, you can just make out on the bottom right-hand side of the screen there, Dark Ghetto, which is a book by Kenneth Clark, an American scholar, published in the mid-1960s, about the ongoing inequalities faced by African Americans in urban areas of America. So, presumably she would have read this. We all know that you don't necessarily always read the books that are on your bookshelves, but she had an interest, perhaps, at least she bought the book, brought it with her to Birmingham, and therefore was interested in the inequalities faced by different ethnic minority communities. And I think the final key influence on Mendelsohn's photographic eye, I think, is the fact that she was a young, white, highly educated woman, American woman, operating in this multicultural, working-class, inner-city, red-light district in late 1960s Birmingham. There wasn't many, to put it bluntly, there wasn't many American people wandering around with a camera in the late 1960s in Birmingham. We've just had a fabulous archive weekend at Ikon. A number of people have come forward to say they actually remembered Janet. One person remembered her having her photograph taken as a young child, and said the first thing that they noticed about her was this broad American drawl. They'd only seen that from the movies. So she stood out, and in a strange way, perhaps, the fact that she stood out made people more open to sharing their most intimate parts of their lives, which we'll see in due course. So what I want to do for the remainder of the lecture is to explore what Mendelsohn's work tells us about this period of British history. What it actually meant to experience a British in one particular inner-city area of Britain in the late 1960s. And what I want to argue is that this experience was often contradictory and ambiguous. In Balsall Heath, issues like prostitution, slum clearance and immigration intersected with race, gender and class, often in kind of ambiguous and certainly unexpected ways. So, for example, Mendelsohn's photographs show us that the local residents were not simply the passive recipients of urban renewal. Immigrant communities in particular were themselves transforming the streets with the establishment of their own cafes, cinemas and other businesses that were catering for the demand of new markets. Visibility in this context was a sign of self-confidence. The names and the prominent facades of these institutions emphasised the cultural presence of new populations. There are examples of migrant communities inserting themselves into the fabric of the city and therefore offer a completely different story to the much more widely known one of the rise of Enoch Powell and various forms of hostility towards immigrant communities. Likewise, whilst the women who worked as prostitutes can be seen as the victims of circumstances like poverty and the violent abuse of male pimps, Mendelsohn also offers a representation of their lives that does not reduce them to the status of victimhood. Mendelsohn focuses on these women's domestic lives, personal relationships, and hopes for the future. In capturing these parts of sex workers' lives, Mendelssohn's archive emphasises the ordinary ways in which these women were active players in the Balsall Heath community. Balsall Heath was actually one of the last areas of Birmingham to have its slums cleared, and actually it was a process that was only just beginning to take place when Mendelsohn was taking these photographs. In 1966, 15% of local households were categorised as overcrowded, and more than 3/4 lacked the exclusive use of a hot tap or toilet. So 75% of households in Balsall Heath in 1966 were sharing a toilet. And I think it's children, as you can see from these photographs, who Mendelsohn captures most overtly interacting with Balsall Heath's dilapidated environment. So, photograph on the right there, girl with her hands on her head. You can see there the dirtiness of her dress, dirtiness of her socks, the kind of discarded pieces of litter and machinery around her. Clearly, potent signs of dilapidation. Then the photograph on the left, as you look at it, you can actually see a group of young children physically playing with the crumbling front wall of someone's garden, and one of the children there is completely naked. Perhaps that's her mother in the background who's going to come out and wrap the child up. Other pictures capture the early stages of slum clearance. So in this photograph, you can see that the buildings are bookended on either side by slum clearance, by a process of slum clearance. And what I think is fascinating about this photograph, I'm not sure if you can see it from the back there, it's not, as I say, it's palpable, it's not particularly great. But the signs on this is a building that, a shop that used to sell gents' clothing. And the signs on this building, I think, illustrate or allude to the way in which slum clearance was often experienced by working class communities through a register of helplessness, as a process that was dictated to from the top down, often with very little consultation. So these signs read things like, "You'll miss us, we'll miss you. We're off after 25 years. We can't take you with us." And I think the most poignant sign is, "They've got us out." So again, it kind of speaks to this idea that slum clearance is taking place from the top down, and you've got no choice in the matter. You're being forced out. I think what's interesting about this idea of being forced out of working class communities too, is that of course these conditions affected everyone that lived in the city areas, but they actually particularly affected immigrant communities, largely because of the discriminatory practices of slum landlords, of the housing authorities. Immigrants were often forced to accept the worst quality housing conditions, and often lived, certainly in extremely cramped whole families to a room, multiple families to a single house. And sociologists in this period saw this as almost as a form of de facto segregation. And some sociologists viewed immigrant communities as a class apart, an underclass almost, a housing class, as some sociologists put it. But Mendelssohn's photography, I think, also provides an insight into the ways in which immigrant communities in particular, but also at the same time as that, able to carry out their own transformations to the built landscape of inner city areas like Balsall Heath. I think that's illustrated by these kind of images in Mendelssohn's work. So she spends a lot of time photographing, bottom the right-hand side of the screen there, Kashmir Coffee Bar. She takes a number of portraits outside Kashmir Coffee Bar, including this one here. And I think it's really, think about the period that we're in, late 1960s. Enoch Powell is about to, or has already made his famous Rivers of Blood speech, talking about repatriation of immigrants. But here you can see, by establishing an institution like Kashmir Coffee Bar, it's an example of immigrant communities actually inserting themselves into the physical landscape of the city. It's a statement to say that we're here to stay. We're moving towards some degree of permanence, and that's also illustrated by the the other photograph here, which actually is a cinema. So long-standing cinema, which was taken over by Asian communities in Balsall Heath in order to meet the growing demand for film, for South Asian cinema, for Bollywood cinema. Upkar, which you can see there on the sign outside that cinema, was one of the biggest selling Indian films of this period. A film that I believe, I've not seen it myself, but I believe it's about an Indian patriot. Someone maybe who has seen it in the audience can correct me if I'm wrong on that. So I think these are an example of communities inserting themselves into the fabric of the city, and are further illustrated by photographs like this. So this is inside one of those cafes. Not the Kashmir, but another one called the Pyar Sagar. Look at the prominence of that mural in the background. What's interesting about this photograph to me is that, fair enough, the cool dudes in the foreground take our attention, but the presence of this mural, based on a scene from a Bollywood movie, again, it's a very important statement about these communities are here to stay. They're not going to be going back to their countries of origin. They're setting themselves up in the local environment. The other interesting side, I think, of Mendelssohn's photographs when it comes to thinking about immigration is the way in which she captures fleeting moments of interaction between different ethnic communities. The kind of moments that don't necessarily leave archival traces behind. So as a historian looking back on the late 1960s, I'm not going to be able to find any conventional archive that tells me about the lollipop lady who had her arm around two South Asian children as they're crossing the road, or about this scene, which must have been a commonplace scene in Balsall Heath in this period. Children playing on the street, sitting on the wall. Here you've got black children, South Asian children in the background, a white mother holding a toddler. Kind of alludes to it provides a different story to the story of the Rivers of Blood or to Peter Griffiths' election. It's a story of a level of multicultural interaction, even a level of convivial multicultural interaction, where communities are feeling, to some degree at least, at home with each other, living next door to each other, living cheek by jowl next door to people who have come from different corners of the globe. I think that's further illustrated as well, actually, by this photograph. Taken again, it's the same cafe inside there. You can just see the mural, and you can actually see what's interesting about that mural there is you can see the sign that the artist has signed it. And thanks to some fantastic research done by Ian Francis at Flatpat Film Festival, we know the artist who that was. It's a man called Kafait Shah, and Kafait Shah himself was an immigrant from South Asia, and he began to make a living out of responding to the need for these new South Asian businesses wanting to decorate their businesses with kind of references to Asian cinema. But what's also interesting about this photograph is the presence of the man there, this white man in a South Asian cafe. It suggests that the assertiveness that I was talking about earlier, this idea that immigrant communities are putting themselves into the landscape and asserting their cultural presence. That wasn't necessarily something that was taking place in opposition to white communities. There was a level of there was some degree of level of interaction between these different communities living, as I say, cheek by jowl, very close together in this 2-mile square radius in Balsall Heath. Another final example of that, I think, is in this photograph. Now, to me, this photograph illustrates vividly the dangers of over-interpreting photographs and becoming too nostalgic for what they appear at first sight to be telling us. So you could see this photograph in the context of what I've just said, what I've just been describing. This level of kind of multicultural conviviality that seems to be at odds with the narrative of hostility that I've talked about at the start of the lecture, Smethwick, Powell, etc. Two black men casually leaning on the car door, smiling, laughing, perhaps sharing a joke with a white policeman. But it's also an ambiguous photograph, something that is suggested out in the fact that we can't actually see the policeman's face. The policeman is looking away from the camera. And that ambiguity is brought to the fore when we think about what Janet Mendelsohn entitled this image. The title of this image is Pimps and a Cop on the Street. So that's kind of characteristic, I think, of the way in which prostitution emerges in Mendelssohn's street photography. Indirectly, often as a result of the contextual knowledge that we may have of what's going on outside each frame. So if you know these photographs were taken in late 1960s Balsall Heath, you know that late 1960s Balsall Heath was a prominent red light district, you may read them slightly differently than if you'd come at these photographs completely cold. And as many of you will know, in 1967, Balsall Heath was the subject of considerable attention from both local and national newspapers as a result of concern about prostitution. The main street for prostitution in Balsall Heath was Varna Road. Between 1966 and 1967, 49 women were arrested for soliciting in Varna Road, but according to one commentator, the houses were, quote, so well known there is limited need for solicitation. At peak time, a virtual queue forms. For the most part, the media's reporting of Balsall Heath in this period was characterised either by a sexualised fascination with the extent of prostitution in the area, or concerns about the potential dangers it could have for other women. In one case, a male journalist from the University of Birmingham newspaper, Red Brick, reported on his own experiences of paying for sex with two women in Varna Road, which he described, quote, like a trip to the dentist. In another newspaper report, a female journalist was sent by the Birmingham Evening Mail to report on what it was like to walk down Varna Road as, quote, a respectable woman. She wrote of feeling like the stranger in the crowd, conscious of the eyes watching me from all sides. Now, this photograph, I think, in many ways, thinking back to that idea of the different ways we can read a photograph, this photograph to me encapsulates many of the themes that we've been talking about so far today. So, you know, the uneven paving in the foreground, you can just make out a loose brick by that woman's foot, signifies of poverty and dilapidation. In the background of the image, you can make out a huddle of children, South Asian or black children. Further along on the right-hand side, we can make out a house that's seemingly been demolished, so it alludes to slum clearance. But also the way in which Mendelssohn's framed this photograph means that we're looking at it, in a sense, through the eyes of these young boys. So in a sense, when we're examining this photograph, we kind of become one of the many gazes that, as the aforementioned journalist put it, watch from all sides as women walk down Balsall Heath streets. And I think that's further kind of illustrated by the deck of cards in that boy's hands, which, you know, is a fairly obvious signifier of vice. I mean, Mendelssohn uses perspective a lot in her photography to illustrate or get at this kind of narrative. So here you can see another photograph taken outside Kashmir Coffee Bar. Seemingly a transaction taking place, again, between a white woman and a black man. Level of multicultural proximity. You can see the litter on the streets, again a symbol of dilapidation or poverty. But again, the fact that we're viewing this transaction through the eyes of this young boy in the foreground, I think gets at another potent narrative of prostitution, which presents prostitution as being a corrupting social force, the potential for corrupting the innocence of youth. And then finally, to thinking about gazes, again, another scene taken outside the Kashmir Coffee Bar, but here Mendelssohn shifts the gaze from a young boy to a man. You can see there in his sunglasses, staring quite aggressively at the group of women standing next to him. And I think Mendelssohn here is kind of alluding to the often aggressive nature of male gazes that could take place within communities like Balsall Heath. So the woman standing in this photograph with her arms folded is Kathleen, who, the time these photographs were taken, was 23 years old and working as a prostitute in Balsall Heath. Mendelssohn turned the photograph she took of Kathleen into a photo essay entitled Varna Road. And I think in many ways that photo essay represents the most political side of Mendelssohn's work. Mendelssohn often achieves his politics by confronting the dominant mythology around prostitution, that women who work as prostitutes are never our daughter, our sister, or our mother. In the vast majority of the photographs, Mendelssohn presents Kathleen in the context of her as a mother to her young daughter. So you can see her. This is an interesting photograph. It's the one photograph where Kathleen is returning Mendelssohn's gaze and actually acknowledging the presence of this camera in her life. So you can see the street in this case doesn't really appear as a site of negotiation, but often appears as one of playfulness, or in some cases is even replaced altogether with scenes from the park. That's actually in Northburn. That's in Aston. That's Aston Park. Some of you may recognise Aston Hall in the background. Mendelsohn, importantly, really importantly in the context of photographers who are working in Britain in this period, Mendelsohn actually follows Kathleen into the home. Very, very few photographers, in Britain at least, do that. Often the tradition would be, in this period, to go into working class communities, photograph what you see on the street, and then go out again. But Mendelsohn gains access to Kathleen's domestic life. Now, of course, as a sex worker, domestic life becomes blurred between public life. Here, I think this is where ambiguity once again re-emerges as a really important theme in Mendelssohn's photography. So for a sex worker in late 1960s Balsall Heath, because of a change in the law in the late 1950s, which outlawed street solicitation and made it much more likely that you'd be arrested for soliciting on the street, women working as prostitutes were forced to try and solicit from the domestic space through the window. So here we can see a woman who we presume to be Kathleen, see her bare legs visible from behind a drawn curtain, and we're presuming that this is what's going on, a process of solicitation. But of course, for Kathleen, the window is also an everyday domestic site. This is Kathleen and her daughter, photographed from the outside by Mendelsohn. So the window here becomes a really interesting site of ambiguity. It's a site of work, it's a site of solicitation, but it's also a site of domesticity in which Kathleen and her daughter are just pictured looking out the window and posing for Mendelssohn's camera. But that's not to say that Mendelssohn avoids completely the subject of Kathleen's work. So this probably is the most shocking photograph in the series. Mendelssohn entitled it "The Bed Where Kathleen Turns Tricks." So it's fairly obvious what's going on here. You can maybe be able to make it out there. The window looks like it's got a piece of glass cut through it. We don't know the exact reason for that, but we can guess. Probably likely that it would be, prostitutes were often targets for violence in Balsall Heath, but largely in the later period. That was more in the 90s than the late 60s. So it's probably more likely that this was a piece of glass cut out of it to make the process of solicitation more straightforward, more easy. You can also see the rickety mattress there, a blanket, patchy carpet. It's the most potent image probably in the series, I would imagine. Mendelssohn left it to the accompanying text to formally articulate the strain that Kathleen's work in Balsall Heath put on her own family relationships. This text, so in the photo essay which was published in Alto in 1969, the photos are framed solely by the interviews that Mendelssohn conducted with Kathleen, with Kathleen's family members and with other players in the Balsall Heath community. And I think these interviews, in many ways, get to the heart of the ambiguous nature of life in Balsall Heath in this period. So in the interviews, Kathleen worries that her mother knows about her work and remarks that if her own daughter, quote, went on the game, I'd chop her legs off. Later in the essay, though, there is an interview with Kathleen's mother, who reveals that she does know about Kathleen's work. Kathleen, quote, had no call to do it. She was never brought up to lead that kind of life. Now, in the photo essay, Mendelssohn reinforces the poignancy of that statement by photographing Kathleen at her mother's home. So, again, you can see the theme of ambiguity, I think, is very clear in this photograph. So the playfulness, these are Kathleen's younger brothers and sisters in the foreground, smiling, cheeky, not without a care in the world. But look at the pensiveness on the face of Kathleen and her mother. They're not looking at each other. They're not looking at the camera. There's a clear theme of ambiguity emerging in this photograph. Race was also a feature of these narratives. Kathleen's mother blamed this man for her daughter's situation. Salim, a recent immigrant from East Africa. For her mother, Kathleen was, quote, made to do it through Salim, and Mendelssohn herself makes it clear that Salim acted as Kathleen's pimp. Mendelssohn stated that Kathleen had lived with and supported Salim for 4 years, whilst in her unpublished notes she writes that Salim referred to himself as Kathleen's ponce. Mendelssohn's unpublished interviews with Kathleen, Salim and other players in Balsall Heath sex industry illustrate most vividly the ambiguous, contradictory nature of life in Balsall Heath. And I think the interviews certainly offer a reminder of the dangers of over-interpreting photography. So whilst Mendelssohn's photographs of the Kashmir coffee bar are suggestive of an apparently convivial, multicultural interaction, not usually associated with the late 1960s, for instance. These were also sites in which some South Asian men were heavily involved in an industry that centred on selling predominantly white women's bodies for sex. So the majority of women working as prostitutes in this time were white. Of the women arrested for solicitation in 1967, for example, 86% were born in England, Wales or Ireland. It was reported, it was common knowledge I think in the late 60s, that it was a prominent Kashmiri family who were responsible for the main players in the Balsall Heath sex industry in this period. So while some of Mendelsohn's photographs that I showed earlier appeared to capture, however fleetingly, an emergent form of multiculture in Balsall Heath, a wider archive suggests that prostitution was a much more problematic, exploitative example of multicultural interaction. With respect to the relationship between Kathleen and Salim, Mendelsohn again emphasises the theme of ambiguity. Salim was the father of Kathleen's daughter, and Mendelsohn also pictures him at the birth of their second child together, which I think really vividly illustrates the nature of the intimate relationship between Kathleen and Janet. Other pimps make it clear the physical abuse that these men subjected women to. "I used to come in, and the first thing I'd do is belt her," one pimp told Mendelsohn. "For nothing, kick her, anything. One day I got mad. I bashed her with a broomstick. Ever since then, she never got too big-headed." I think the power balance of the relationship between Kathleen and Salim is illustrated particularly well in this photograph. The ambiguity, again, what's going on here. You could read this perhaps as a kind of playful, convivial scene of two lovers in bed together. But look at the difference in facial expressions between Kathleen and between Salim. Salim catching Mendelsohn's gaze, asserting his power, again, is in the position of authority over Kathleen, certainly, but arguably even over Janet too, the way he's returning the gaze of Janet's lens. But Mendelsohn also allows for a more sympathetic reading of Salim. In his interview, Salim talks about his hopes for his newborn son. "When he is older," Salim remarks, "I'll tell him, look, my life is no good. If he learns properly, he could be a doctor, a pilot or anything, so that people will say, look, there is Salim's son, and I will be proud." Shortly after these photographs were taken, in November 1968, Salim was stabbed to death in an unnamed local cafe. I just want to quickly bring this together by way of conclusion. There's lots of unanswered questions about Mendelsohn's work, which are not answered even when Janet came to Birmingham in January to see the exhibition on the walls of an art gallery for the first time in almost half a century. There's a picture of Janet today. In particular, we do not know the exact nature of Mendelsohn's relationship with Kathleen, how she was able to gain access to the most intimate parts of Kathleen's life, the basis of what seemed like a genuine friendship, the conversation that we presume must have had about what Mendelsohn was going to do with these photographs that she was taking on a daily and even, it seems, an hourly basis. And I think that ambiguity is in keeping with the overall importance of Mendelsohn's work and the way it truthfully captures the ambiguities and contradictions of navigating a rapidly changing inner-city area in late 1960s Britain. And I think it's the unusualness of Mendelsohn's perspective meant that she was perhaps most attuned to the ambiguities taking place around her. Mendelsohn's work can contribute to a better understanding of this period of history. Her archive enables us to see the late 1960s in terms of the presence of a seemingly convivial multicultural interaction, for example, as well as the arrival of powerlism. To unpick the often problematic and interconnectedness of this with both poverty and prostitution, and it enables us to see women working as prostitutes as the victims of poverty and male abuse, but at the same time as active agents whose personal relationships, domestic lives and hopes for the future are also of historical importance. I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming and thanks for listening.